Hello everyone, and thank you for joining APQC's April Process and Performance Management webinar, leveraging the PCF to create manageable enterprise models. A few things to note. We are live tweeting during this webinar, so be sure to join the conversation on Twitter and use the hashtag #PPMAPQC. As a reminder, audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are muted. This is the Q&A tool located on the right of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them here and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording in a few days. I would now like to pass the presentation off to Holly Lycogland, the Process and Performance Management Principal Research Lead here at APQC.
All right, thank you, Maddie, and thank you all for joining us today. We always appreciate your time. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and my colleague, John Tesmer, who will be taking us along this Adventures in Modeling webinar. John is the Director of Open Standards Benchmarking and the Product Owner for Mosaic at APQC, but he's also the shepherd and the expert on all things process and classification, the PCF, or Process Classification Framework. So without further ado, John, let's get started.
Right on. Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending. And I guess probably the best way to get started is just to say, there we go, making sure I have keyboard control here. Right on. Okay, what you're going to learn today. So probably the first thing you'll learn is what it means to really adopt a process classification framework, or a PCF. We have lots of questions about that in practice from members and anyone who's ever downloaded a PCF. And there are wide schools of thought on what that means, but I hope to give you sort of our definition of what that means today. We'll talk a little bit about characteristics of good governance, because that's a critical success factor in the long-term value that you get out of a process framework. And then finally, this concept of integrating downstream models to get the highest sort of value out of your adoption. Now, a lot of people will look at this and say, well, this is just enterprise architecture, or this is capability mapping, or whatever the terminology is. That's great. I would love if we all standardized on some common terminology, or at least sort of started to agree to disagree on what this kind of stuff is. If you have any questions throughout this whole presentation, I highly encourage you to use the GoToMeeting questions and chat feature. I'm not sure if there's a hands up, hands down thing, but Holly is going to be manning the mic there, and she knows to interrupt me whenever I get off on a tangent, or if I've got some relevant questions. So the way I've structured this presentation is in 3 acts, kind of like a comedy or a tragedy or a drama, some kind of Greek history thing. But there's 3 acts. And the first act is adoption. So one of my favorite actors is this guy. His name's Shia LaBeouf, and I think he's hilarious. He's eccentric now. But early on in his career, he played in some Disney movies. He played in some Transformer movies. You might recognize him. But most recently, he did this motivational kind of video, an art piece, and the message that he gave was just do it. And he spent a lot of time trying to convince people that no matter what your obstacle is, the biggest thing in your way is you, and you can do it. Just do it. So when we distribute the slides, the link down there is to that video. I encourage you to go watch it. But just do it is such an important sort of tenet of what it means to adopt a framework. You can't adopt a framework in a committee. You can't adopt a framework with the consensus of millions of people. It's a very, especially at this point in the adoption of frameworks, there's a lot of education that has to happen in order to convince people that it's important to do. So what we find is a great success factor is to just kind of ask for forgiveness. And you'll see as we go along some of the criteria for adoption where we talk about how to really succeed in that. But the first tenet and the first thing I really want you to take away from this is the fact that you just have to do it. Adoption is super easy when you take some of these steps, and you can make sure not to upset the apple cart too much as you go along. Now let's talk about the minimum criteria for what it means to adopt. So let's say we've made the decision, we're going to ask for forgiveness, we've decided we're going to adopt a process framework at our organization. The 3 sort of minimum criteria for success are that the framework has to be centrally accessible, It has to be considered authoritative for whatever purpose it is you've decided to adopt it, and you've got to have suitable governance in place. Without these three pieces, you will fail. These are the three absolute minimum criteria. And you'll notice as we get along here that there's one really important one that's missing that I have a good rationale for, sort of as we get going. So let's talk now about the first one, the concept of central accessibility. And the theme here that I want you to remember is that it's all relative, okay? Now, this is a picture of the finance function in the process classification framework version 7, okay? And I've omitted all of the activities and tasks, and I've also omitted the higher level stuff around finance. But what I want you to see in this and what I want you to gather here is that this set of 11 elements, from perform planning and management accounting all the way through performing global trade services, is comprehensive. And by comprehensive, what I mean is that it is collectively exhaustive. It means that there's not anything else that you could put in this list of 11 that would further expand what it means to do finance. We've considered it all. And the way that we've considered it all over time is by talking to hundreds and hundreds and maybe even thousands of organizations around the world and asking them what they do in finance. And we've created this vision of what it means to do finance. So once you understand this, you can start to ask yourself, well, where do we want to adopt the process framework? And really, what's the point? Knowing that every part of the process framework that you look at, very much like this finance function, will be comprehensive, will be collectively exhaustive. So asking yourself that question, where does it belong? We're going to continue with this finance example. Because the process framework is exhaustive, no matter what level you look at it in the process framework, you can adopt the framework at any level in your organization, much like in the same way that there's this theory of fractals and chaos, and if you sort of drill into a fractal image, the closer you get to the very bottom, it looks the same as it was at the top. It's the same basic kind of principle. No matter where you adopt the framework, whether it's at the highest level of your organization across all of the functions, which is great, or if you centralize on it in the finance function and you adopt it just in finance, but you exclude HR and IT and product development, or even further down, if you adopt the process framework in one specific process in finance, it's great. That's the best place to start, because remember, that central rule, that central tenet that we're going to talk about of the process framework, that it's comprehensive, that it's collectively exhaustive. This rule ensures that if you adopt even just one small part of your organization, then other parts of your organization, as they adopt their portion of the PCF, are not going to be in conflict with what you've already adopted, because the process framework, the process classification framework, is so comprehensive. We've already thought of every aspect of it. So you as a business process professional, you as the owner of a process, you as the owner of a function, can make a decision to adopt the process framework or scope the process framework to the extent of your locus of control. And that way, if your downstream process partner decides to adopt the process framework, they already have your sort of adoption as a guide, and the work that they're doing downstream can integrate, because again, it's comprehensive, it's collectively exhaustive, okay? And just again, the core aspect of this, every part of the PCF is intended to be collectively exhaustive, which means you can adopt it anywhere. So you can centralize it at any part of your organization. So let's now talk about the second aspect of adoption. Second aspect of adoption, the framework is considered authoritative. Now, what is authoritative? So I love this image. At some point, you've decided to make this adoption, and someone has sort of rubber stamped the framework and said, this is the truth. This is the single layer of the truth. They have declared that through frameworks and through structure, we have freedom. And now we have groups of people who are doing work. So the folks on the left are brainstorming and dealing with data. The folks on the top right are dealing with organizational structures and trying to understand how processes align there. The people on the bottom right are doing process designs, and they're seeing how frameworks support their flow charts and all that stuff. The problem that many organizations have in the absence of an authoritative framework is that there is a shifty or unstable foundation that they are basing all their work on. When you adopt a process framework, you create this underlying, collectively exhaustive, totally comprehensive model that answers or has the ability to answer all these questions. Once it gets stamped as being authoritative and agreed upon by that central sort of authority, then we now have it, it's trusted, it's accurate, it's reliable, because that's how we've made this decision. And it becomes acknowledged as a single point of trust. You have to remember that the structure and adopting and agreeing that we're going to use this as our structure sets you free. You no longer have to try to define things without the structure that the PCF puts in place. You have an easy way to have conversations about process and about structure. The authoritative decision and really making the agreement that this is the single source of truth helps to keep that freedom in place. So as people start to do different models or create different downstream dependencies, there is the one source of truth that makes sure that everyone's talking about the same thing. Okay. Now, a counterexample here is when we create models in our world, be they data models, be they network models, be they organizational structures, or even independent process models that don't depend on a single authoritative source of truth. What happens in that case? What we find is that individuals spend a lot of time reconciling when they do try to come together. So if you have a process model and you try to talk to a downstream group that modeled independently of you and didn't have an authoritative framework to work on, you can understand there's going to be some gaps that have to be resolved. Maybe even some redundant language that has created confusion. The problem is even multiplied even more when you have a situation that you're trying to use a process model to understand how to allocate work to physical parts of your business. Shared services centers, acquisitions, divestitures. There's a lot of risk of creating these models and making business decisions without that central sort of authoritative tool. Again, the PCF, once adopted, can be accepted as the authoritative sort of answer, if you will, to any of those business questions. Now, the next sort of tenet, or the third sort of leg of this, is governance. So remember, there's three critical success factors for process framework adoption. Centrally accessible, meaning that we've adopted it either in our finance function or in a certain part of our finance, and that's the scope that we're going to deal with, and it's accessible to everybody that depends on that thing. It's authoritative, so everyone who's depending on that knows that it's really the source of truth, and there aren't three copies floating around someplace. And then ultimately, this last piece is the suitable governance program. Now, what is governance? Okay, so remember we had this concept of the framework is authoritative, right? It's the answer. But as people start to use it and try to build off of it and try to create value from it, they're going to have suggestions. They're going to have changes. They're going to have all kinds of exciting inputs to you. And your job as the person who's responsible for this adoption is to make sure that you've got governance in place that maintains those first two aspects. And the first aspect being that it's centrally managed and centrally sort of owned. And the second, that it's authoritative. If you start to fail in the first, then someone will create another framework and reduce the authority of yours. If you fail in the second, then you're all over the place. You've got all kinds of problems. But suitable governance is a huge aspect of it. What does suitable governance mean? It establishes some central core answers. How do we make updates? Who's allowed to make those updates? When the changes are released, the kind of changes that we allow, and even something as simple and tactical as where is this framework maintained? So a lot of organizations have centralized sort of document management systems. SharePoint is a huge, commonly seen one that we've got. We also have clients that are using BlueWorks, or they're using software AG products like Eris. iGraphics is another popular one. Signavio, another great tool. These are all partner organizations that we've worked with in the past. Without governance in place, then you start to lose people's adoption. And what that means is people have a change, they need this change made or rationalized to understand how their value can be extracted from the framework, from the central adoption. If you can't support that, then you've lost the ability to keep those people involved. And again, when that happens, when you lose that authoritative sort of structure, then people might create their own framework. And it may not be based on the process framework. And then at that point, you lose this concept of the central sort of definition of what a process is. And then you're back to square one. You've got all kinds of competing models. Now, I want you to note here that the specific discussion about what kinds of specific content is going to be accepted is not included in your governance plan. We're talking about the kind of changes that we're going to allow, which are sort of the rules of the content that comes in. But in governance, we don't necessarily say we're going to accept e-commerce but not legacy retail. Like those are not the kind of decisions that happen necessarily in governance. And the reason that we don't encourage that in the governance area is because we want to see the process framework reacting to change that you see in your business. So we talk about the kind of changes, meaning structural changes. We don't want redundancy. We don't want to create violations of the rules, but we don't talk about the kind of content that could be allowed in. So that's an important understanding for governance. All right, moving on. Adoption is not. This is another sort of important way to look at things. Many individuals who come to APQC have this perspective that they need to change the framework to reflect exactly the structure of their organization. So what they end up doing is trying to create a framework that has multiple copies of, let's say, accounts payable, one for each shared services center they operate. Or maybe they have a variation of the accounts payable process that includes 10 extra steps because of a regulatory requirement. They try to create a separate accounts payable framework aspect for that. We don't want that. We don't want you to change the structure of the PCF to reflect your organization's unique nature. We expect you to add process elements where necessary to ensure that there's consistency, but the PCF has some rules in it that we'll talk about in just a minute that help us to make sure that it's going to maintain value across all of the disparate uses across your entire organization. The other situation that we see is an individual tightly coupling themselves, and I've even heard of individuals who say, well, I'm Mr. 9.0 or I'm Mr. 3.2, and that's not necessarily what we want people to do. We don't want you to recast your organization's structure to match the process framework. That's not a good critical success factor for adoption. You don't have to do that. Where we expect to see the framework implemented and adopted is centrally, and that central is relative to wherever it is inside of your organization. It's not based on utilization as well, which means just because only 10 people are using the framework doesn't mean that it's not adopted. As long as you and one other person are getting value out of it, then your framework can be considered adopted and can be considered authoritative for the purposes that you're dealing with. What we found, even through some of our oldest best practice studies about the adoption of process frameworks, is when an organizational unit as small as a department, some people may call it a work group. If you're looking at the PCF, we're talking about a process. An organizational unit as small as that, as small as a process level, saying, this is what we do. We have adopted the framework for our process. We are representing this, and this is the things that we do, and this is where it aligns, and we've created these models that reflect that. That adds huge value So even inside of one little organization and one tiny little part of the business doing it, there's a lot of value there. And the value starts to multiply according to the network effect as more people adopt the framework, even outside of that organization that's adopted it. So let's say you had a small group in finance, maybe accounts payable again, that adopted the PCF. Now you've got a different part of your organization, let's say it's in supply chain, adopting the PCF. Now you have two parts of your organization using a common language to talk about what they're doing. As a manager, as a director, as a vice president, as a C-level person, that transparency into what my organization does is hugely valuable, even if it's not fully connected yet. So just keep that in mind. And then the other aspect of this, and I hope you've sensed this through my levity as I've been kind of rushing through and talking about the PCF, adoption is not intended to be hard. It doesn't require a lot of rigmarole. As a matter of fact, the less difficulty that you can impose around it, the better. And the more adoption that you'll start to see. Organic growth is not necessarily bad in this case, especially because the concept, this idea of creating a mapping is, number one, relatively novel. So a lot of people don't necessarily think in terms of frameworks. But number two, it's readily understandable. Once you explain to somebody, this is what this is doing, it's a really simple way to talk about this, then they get it. And as long as you have the centralized adoption of it, and you have the authoritative nature of it, and you have the governance plans in place, it's not hard. It can actually be pretty fun. Go for it, Holly. Yeah, I hear you.
Before we move on to the next section, we had a couple of questions. One person wanted to get a little bit more clarity around what kind of changes are or are not covered in governance. Just to kind of rescope that question a little bit.
I love it. And I'm not going to answer it right now because I have a whole section I'm going to talk about it to death. So whoever asked that question, you are a mind reader, and thank you.
All right, the second question is, from your experience, where in the organization should the framework be managed?
There is no should. There is no where in the organization. And I'll tell you, I hate that answer, it depends, but it's so true, because what I have found in my experience over the past 13 years talking to companies that have used or touched or even smelled the PCF in any way is that it's always different. I can tell you that my vision, in the vision I'd love to craft in a world I'd love to create, is where every organization has a chief operating officer that maintains this framework as the list of what we do as a business. And it's centralized at the highest level of the organization and federated and distributed out. That would be ideal in my world, in my opinion. What I see in practice, however, is much different, much more different than that, because of all the reasons I've mentioned before. Because people don't know what a framework is. They don't know how to use it. They don't know where it fits. They think it's hard. They think the governing one is going to be a pain in the butt. There's all kinds of reasons that people don't do it. But I think what we've also seen over those 13 years is that even when it starts really, really small in a kernel of a department, because of the nature of the framework, because it is so comprehensively defined, even if that one little part of the department grabs onto this process framework, they haven't just grabbed onto their process. They've grabbed onto every single process in the organization without even knowing it. So it makes it very easy and very low cost, if you think about it, to start distributing that across the organization because it's already defined. You don't need a tiger team or a huge mass of people to go and recreate wheels all over the place because somebody adopted this. You need someone to take a look at, well, here's what we're doing, here's what the framework says we're doing, here's where we map, here are the changes we need to be made, and we go to the governance function and get those changes implemented, and now it's even more clear and more germane to our organization.
Right, and I know also from the research, we have also always seen that the culture and the purpose of adopting a framework really drives who has ownership and is in charge of that governance.
Huge, absolutely.
So, okay, thank you.
Right on. Okay, any more questions there, Holly?
Not currently. We can move in next act.
Okay, so before we go to the next act, I just want to tell you what successful adoption looks like. It answers the question, do we have a consistent way to talk about our business processes? Yes or no? Successful adoption means yes, we do. We have a language, we have a Rosetta Stone, and there are going to be ways that you will use the process framework that you never even imagined doing it. Because what the process framework does is the equivalent of standardizing some very complex thing across the world. And this is an example I love to use. I don't have a slide for it, but in the Wild West and even in parts of Europe in the mid 1800s, there was not a standardized rail gauge. So moving cargo and people and information across wide geographic distances was time consuming, error prone, and very, very costly. So what ended up happening in the late 1800s globally is the adoption of basically standards of how far apart the tracks are in a railroad. And what that meant was a car full of produce coming out of Southern California could end up in New York without anybody touching it. It could go from point A to point B completely without any effort. It reduced the cost and spurred on so much growth and expansion in the world that we wouldn't be the same country without it, same world without it. The same is true of process frameworks. When you standardize the language of what you do, talking about what you do, you no longer have to recreate the wheel every time you go try to define something or try to map something or try to model something. So it's that Rosetta Stone, it's that standardization that really helps. And again, it's easy, it's fun. It's supposed to make it so that everyone's job gets a little easier, and it makes it so that it's widely respected and utilized. And it really shouldn't be cost prohibitive. I mean, the framework itself is free. The biggest effort you're going to expend is coaching people in change management, getting people to adopt it. Okay, Act 2. This is where we sense some conflict. Good governance. There will be conflict. Okay, so let's talk about governance for a second. I would like to classify governance as having two tiers. The first tier of governance, probably the most viciously fought battles, will be in protecting the framework, okay? So you've adopted this framework. You've said, this is mine. I'm gonna just basically take a copy of it, put it in Mosaic, and now it's our framework. And that was like literally a 30-second decision. Maybe a minute if you have more than one framework you're copying from. But now I've got this framework, and now my job is to pick up my sword and my shield and protect the framework, because people are gonna wanna change it. But I can't protect too hard, because if I do, then I don't support the business. So that's the second tier of governance. I have to create governance that supports my business and reacts as necessary to the changing parts of the business. 10 years ago, people weren't necessarily doing things they're doing today. I mean, it's 2018. 10 years ago, they just introduced the iPhone. So you can imagine people weren't carrying around devices as ubiquitously as they are today. The world has changed. So if the processes and the framework can't change to support that, we got an issue. We're going to lose the adoption that we had. So what that means is we break this down. The first tier, protecting the framework. What this means is you're going to have debates. People are going to come to you. People are going to ask you to do things that are unnatural. Your job, your priorities are to maintain MISI, maintain HFD, and maintain the glossary. Now, what these things mean, as let's say the example I used before, where someone comes to me with the desire to add another sourcing strategy process, because I've got online sourcing and offline sourcing. You have created a violation of MISI, because now these two things are effectively talking about the same concept, but now they're not mutually exclusive anymore. They share so much of the same thing, they're basically the same. What you're looking at is a variance. And in that case, the business rule for us is put the processes inside of the parent that expand the definition of it to include the variance. Same thing with exceptions. We would expect to see a framework element in there that said resolve exceptions. If you had to deal with exceptions in there and you had your own special little task for how do you resolve exceptions, stick it in there. And that absolutely is maintaining the mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive aspect of the framework. But that's a battle you have to fight, because there are going to be people who want to come to you and tell you to violate this rule in the framework. So that's important. Next one, hierarchical functional decomposition. This is basically saying every element in the process framework follows a pattern. It follows this verb-noun kind of approach, right? And it's decomposed from the parent sort of function. So you have IT, you have finance, you have HR, you have whatever other categories there are in your business. We've decomposed these hierarchically, so parent-child relationship, according to the function. And we follow the same basic premise of how we word these things, verb, noun, verb, noun, verb, noun. What we've seen in the past is people try to sneak in here characteristics that aren't verb, noun, and that don't follow that hierarchical functional decomposition. They try to create loops. They try to create all kinds of crazy stuff that just doesn't belong in the framework. Again, your number one governance tier is protecting the framework. So that's important. And then number 3, the glossary. Glossary is tricky, okay? And it's tricky because everybody perceives things a little differently. There's going to be a lot of conversation. There's going to be a lot of questions like, well, what does it really mean, man? People coming to you and really just kind of probing, well, what does it mean to collaborate with suppliers? You know, at some point you're going to have to just sit down and define collaboration with suppliers means X, boop, 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 boop. Now, we at APQC have done a lot of that definition for you, and maintaining that definition is a part of your job as the person who's adopted the framework and part of defending it. But it also is a guide. It really helps you to understand when you've got a redundant situation, or when someone's coming to you and what they have truly is a variance or an exception that needs to be documented in there. So this is kind of what you do as the governance person that's protecting the core of the framework. Now, Holly, I feel like there's a question. I'm getting some ESP tingles of a question there. What do you think?
All right, I think we have 2 questions that would fit with this slide.
Let's go.
All right, the first one is somebody wanted a little help with the concept of MECE, and if you could give them an example.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love MECE. So if you look at the example I have on the slide here, I have procure materials and services 421, which is, it says develop sourcing strategies. 422 says select suppliers and develop and maintain contracts. And 423 says order materials and services. So MECE in this case means that for the parent, procure materials and services, its children are all mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And what that means is that every single one of those things I just read, the 3 things there, 421, 422, and 423, they do not overlap at all. They're completely mutually exclusive. That's a huge, very important tenet of the process framework. And it even applies outside of 421. I mean, it applies anywhere. You would never see a sourcing strategies process in the IT function. You would never see sourcing strategies in the new product development function. Sourcing strategies is defined here in procure materials and services because I said so. And that's sort of the definition is when you adopt the framework, you get it because APQC said so. The whole concept of collectively exhaustive is also, again, because APQC said so. We said procure materials and services is 421, 422, and 423. In your organization, you may have another process that's defined as, maybe it's accept, process purchase orders or something like that. And maybe it's not listed, specifically in here, or maybe it is. Maybe we have that process element someplace else in the framework. It doesn't belong in here because that's the way that we've defined the framework. And when we say it's collectively exhaustive, it means all these 3 things, while you may define it differently, but these 3 things define what procure materials and services means. So these 3 things are the only 3 things that matter to us. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think one of the clarifications is the different why a framework needs to be MECE is because it is that one instance of what this process means. Now, when you go into your modeling and your maps, it may show up in multiple places, but it's the same process element, right? Yes,
and I'll even give you another really great example. There is a childhood toy, and I won't say the name of the toy, but it's little interlocking polycarbonate bricks. On top there are circles, on bottom there are holes. And this company makes a decision. They say, we are going to make a brick that is 1 unit tall and 4 units wide and 2 units deep, and we're going to call this brick number 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to make a brick that is 1/2 of a unit tall and 1 unit wide and 1 unit deep, and this is unit 1, 2, 4. And when you, as a child, take these 2 pieces and you build a beautiful model out of them, you've created something new. But you did it because those pieces were defined by someone, and they had characteristics and attributes, and they had a standardized way of fitting together and a standardized way of working. It's no different here in the framework world, whether it's the process framework or the ETOM framework or the SCORE model. These are all systems to simplify and abstract a very complex world into a manageable system. And we'll actually talk about this in just a minute, but yeah, simplifying and modeling is a good explanation of why this is important.
Okay. All right. The last question we have before we can move on for this section is, so the Enterprise Architecture Group is promoting the PCF in their government organization. Their IT branch has decided to align with 8.0. They haven't renamed their local processes to match the PCF, but they're treating them as the classification rather than the proto processes. Is this being counter to the consistent language?
It's hard to say that it's counter to the consistent language because the consistent language still exists. It's just that you've created some other layer to help disambiguate it in your organization. Personally, I think that's okay. Because at the end of the day, as long as you're educating people that the single source of the truth about what we're doing as an organization is the framework, then you still get the value. All of those secondary models, all the tertiary models, as long as they continue to point back reliably to the center sort of core, then you still get a lot of value out of it.
Thank you.
All right, so I talk fast and I talk a lot and I still have so many slides. So I will try to keep my examples to a minimum, but please keep your questions coming. Governance tier 2, so tier 1, remember, was protecting the framework, and we have to do that in order to support the business. It's like protecting the foundation of the house. If you have a weak foundation, your house is going to crumble around you. Same concept of supporting the framework, supporting the business. The 7 or 8 or 9 things I've listed here are things you're going to have to do in order to govern the framework to respect the business. You have to accept their feedback, distribute the changes down. So, you know, if IT says, hey, we just encountered a new way of doing things, we're going to retire this process and add this new one in, that has to be fed out everywhere. It's because, again, the centralization aspect of this. There's a role for maintaining concurrency with APQC. And again, that's something that's kind of optional. You don't always have to maintain the same version that we do. Marketing and using and promoting the framework. This is important part of change management, letting people know there's a framework out there so they don't go create their own. Lots of stuff happens here, but I think you get the idea that this is a little different than keeping those business rules intact. This is more around the interface between the business and the framework, and kind of like that layer that we were just talking about a second ago. Now, I want to introduce you real quick to APQC's 7 tenets of process management, and I will award you all. You are the first people outside of APQC to witness this wheel graphic. So consider yourselves very much lucky, unfortunate. The dark blue circle in here, these are our 7 tenets of process management. You can see that in order to effectively manage process and get business performance results, you need a process model. That's your PCF. You need governance, very strong, very much required here. Change management, we've talked about a little bit. These other things come because you have a process model in place, because you have strong governance, because you have change management. You can start to build some of these other things. But me, if you ask me personally, these are the ones I think are most important for you. This outer ring represents the steps of the process and the life cycle of how we do process management, identifying and organizing all the way through managing and supporting. Lots of consultants speak there, but this is a great example to talk about sort of where we need to go from a process perspective. Now, we've had some conflict. We had some defenses we had to do. Let's now talk about integration and the huge value that comes out of it. I talked a minute ago about a model and how models are critically important, but let's talk about what a model really is, okay? On the left, we have this plastic toy model. As a child, I built these. I built dozens of them. I even had motorized ones. I never flew radio-controlled airplanes, but I did race stadium trucks and nitromethane-powered radio-controlled cars and all kinds of cool stuff like that. I never was able to take that into a true four-wheeled vehicle and drive on Baja or do the Dakar Senegal rally or anything like that. But the model was as close as I could get, right? In this case, this model is made of plastic. It has a detailed cockpit. It's got some authentic markings. It may even fly, but definitely not at the same speed. The model on the right, obviously this is a picture because I don't have a real F-18 or F-22 or whatever this is to hand you. It's a model, but it's a little more realistic, right? The real one, however, is made of metal, and it's got a functional cockpit, and it's capable of raining down terror. So you want to avoid that. But anyways, it's a model, right? Models represent something in reality. That plastic model on the left is sufficient to do something, but not everything that the real world one has. Let's talk about why the model is important, what purpose it serves. Helps you understand proportions, right? Looking at this model of an airplane, I can get an understanding of what the real airplane looks like. I can build a hangar. I can build a runway. I can start to understand how a human would fit inside of here. I can understand the armaments and some of the things that might require a visualization. Is it suitable to carry 100 people? Absolutely not. Not in its current configuration. No way. I can also understand integrations with other models. I flip the plane over. How many bomb slots do I have? How many places can I put, whatever I'm going to put on here? You can also do things like destructive tests, like how much can I bend the wing before it falls off, right? I don't want to do that to a real plane, but if I create a model that has the same characteristics as a real wing on a smaller scale, I can extrapolate. I can do tests that might destroy this thing and do 100 of them real fast. So models are great for those purposes. Now, from an organizational perspective, what are the models that we care about? Look at the numbers on the right, 1 through 7 there. We got industry models. These industry models are things that we use to do things like have EDI networks. I mean, that's old school, but now we're talking about XML languages and JSON languages where we're interchanging data with our partners. Business unit models, this is as simple as understanding how we distribute work in our organization, okay? This is just an example of the business unit model. For me, I call them org structures or org charts. The real important thing I want you to take away from this is if I have this convoluted example of the world at the top here with a headquarters in Brazil and 3 shared service centers and a manufacturing and operating unit, I can use a process framework aligned to this model here to understand what work is being done in each of these areas. So I have a model of my physical organization, I have the model of my processes, I can align the two. And then I can start to ask important questions like, which parts of my business are doing the same thing? Is Shared Services Center 1 and Shared Services Center 2 really doing the same work? And are they doing it effectively? Are they doing it efficiently? Now that I have a standard way of talking about what work is being done, I can measure that work consistently and objectively across both of those. As a leader in the organization, making these decisions and determining when to put shared services centers out, when to take them back, or even more, when to acquire or divest parts of my organization, using the process framework as the core language to understand and relate those models is huge, is very valuable. Looking now at information systems models, how many times have you done an assessment and realized you had 2 information systems for the same business process? They were redundant. This happens all the time. Maybe a new version of software comes out and adds a new process that it can process on your behalf. So maybe Great Plains didn't have a payroll module before, but now it does. Now you got to figure out, well, what is now obsolete? What exactly can this feature do that I need to do in my organization? And how does it map to my existing set of processes? The process framework as a building block of this information systems model helps you make that rationalization decision. So I can say, here's Great Plains version 1.2. It handles these 5 process groups, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And oh, by the way, I use an Excel spreadsheet for process group 6 and 7, but in Shared Services Center 2, it's total Excel spreadsheets. They have nothing. We can start to make decisions, effective decisions about how to move our investments. Now you start to see how this can influence strategic planning and start to influence goal setting. Let's talk about data models for a second. From a data modeling perspective, this is down in the weeds. This is very detailed, but I will tell you, there is a lot of value to be had here, especially when you start to try to understand the systems relationships and are we pushing the data all over the world for no reason, and why do we have 3 definitions of a client, and all that stuff. Processes are huge. This table I've shown here is just one really simple example of how we've used the process framework to model data relationships back to core conceptual entities. Huge value in being able to do that. Client in this case is updated by managed customers and accounts and owned by managed customers and accounts, updated by sales orders but not owned by sales orders. Really easy way to quickly get a definition of what something's doing, how it works, how it integrates. Now, bringing it all together, this is where it's very powerful. The process framework itself answers one really simple question. What is it that we're doing in our organization from a process perspective? Once we understand that, we can start to define the flow of work. We can define flow charts. We can define RACI diagrams. We can create SIPOC models. There's all kinds of incredible things we can do once we understand what it is we do, and we're using the same language throughout our enterprise to have this kind of conversation. That's the definition piece. The delivered piece. Now we start to understand, where is this process delivered? Is it delivered in a shared services center? Is it handled by the headquarters? Is it distributed across multiple parts of our business? Is it executed by a system? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it consistent across our organization? The PCF gives you the power to create the downstream models that are reliable and consistent and can answer those questions. They can even start to understand ownership. So I can say that Holly owns the procure materials and services process in the United States because it's distributed in this shared services center. She doesn't own the one in Europe because that's owned by Maddie. And that's how that works. And if we want to change it, here are the 5 pieces that have to change. It's the equivalent of saying, like, here's a little thread on the bottom of a sweater, and I pull it, and now I understand exactly how the sweater was constructed. Question to you is, can you trace in your organization from the work that an individual does through the way that it's distributed in your organization, the system that it's used, the owner of that particular process, the data that uses it? Do you have consistent models? Can you bring them all together? I would propose to you that you can't. The PCF can help you. It can reduce the barrier to being able to do that. It can help you integrate these disparate models. And if anyone out here is dealing with GDPR, for example, I have a 7-step solution to how you resolve your GDPR problems, starting with adopting the framework and all the way down to resolving issues. And there's, obviously it's oversimplified, but there's a little magic in the middle, and that magic has to do with being able to understand the traceability of everything in your organization when you use process as the center of your universe. That all being said, I think, Holly, now I'm ready to answer more questions.
Excellent. We have quite a few questions. We have a quick 2 questions that we can answer in regards to slide 21.
Slide 21, here I go.
Slide 21. All right.
Yes.
So the first question, they wanted to understand what the numbers in the parentheses next to the elements from the PCF are.
Okay. You want me to answer that first or wait for the second part?
You can answer that one first real quick.
Right on, okay. The numbers in the parentheses are numbers that we at APQC assign that represent the concept that you see listed there. So for example, the concept of procuring materials and services is always going to be represented by that index number, 10216. if you see that we have 20 different releases of the framework, most of them have used the same consistent definition of what procurement is, 10216. Some of them have actually changed the definition of procure materials and services. Maybe they've added a whole other process because that's what our subject matter experts in the field said they wanted. In that case, it would get a new number because it's conceptually different. But again, this concept, this 10216, is intended to span over time the definition of conceptually what this means.
Okay, excellent. And the other question was simply they want a clarification what HFD means, and really all that meant was it's the number below it, which is hierarchical function decomposition. Correct, John?
Absolutely. And I'll just pose to you an example. And I wish I was standing in a room full of people, because I'll say, okay, first person to be able to do this, raise your hand, okay? Don't obviously do it, I can't see you, but somebody go find for me 10290, okay? And I'm gonna time you, and it's gonna take you 30 seconds, maybe a minute, because you gotta read the whole thing. But if I told you, go find me 4223, you would find that in a much faster way, because those hierarchy numbers, as a human being, you can kind of infer how they work, right? So I see 42, I see 421, and then I see 422, and there's 4223. Boom, I already found it. And look, it's the same as 10290. So the numbers have different purposes. Please remember, those hierarchical numbers will change over time. That's why when somebody says, I'm Mr. 8.0 or I'm Mr. 4.2, I kind of shiver a little bit because we may change it tomorrow, I don't know. But you know, those numbers will change. The intent there is just to give you an easy to use handle to try and find something.
Okay, all right, excellent. So the next question, they were asking about scope, and I think slide 28 is kind of where we touched on the topic for this one, which is how do you handle scope within a process? For example, one function is responsible for customer service processes for CONUS, C-O-N-U-S, and another for OCONUS, O-C-O-N-U-S.
This is great. I love this question. So remember, the beginning of this slide, this presentation, my goal for you was to adopt a framework, and I wanted you to just do it, okay? So I don't care what your business unit models are like. I don't care how they're distributed. You have one framework, and that one framework represents what we do as an organization. It has all of the exceptions, it has all of the variances, and it's all stored centrally, and it's maintained and governed with a happy day and all this other stuff, right? So when you have these two different shared service centers or these two different ways of doing something, even if those two different areas are doing portions of a process. So let me just go back one couple slides here so I can find what I want. Yeah, okay. Let's say that, you know, the CONUS one was working on, you know, this, 422, right? Doing this 422, and the other one was doing, you know, 421 through 424, right? But you've omitted these 5, 6, and 7, right? That's okay. That's okay. You've just used the process framework to identify a gap. You've now figured out, I've got this part done here, I've got this part done there, but where are these three things happening? Why aren't they mapped up someplace? That's a great way to find areas where you've got risk in your organization, or you've got overlap, or you've got redundancy, or you've got, you know, any kind of structural issues that you got to deal with. If you're trying to document like compliance with SOC regulations or ISO standards, you can use a process framework to show how you've mapped and traced how this is pertinent throughout your entire organization. So I hope I've answered that question. I'm willing to accept a follow-up if I haven't answered it correctly.
Okay. Well, we have a slightly related one, and I think this is about the concept of how we put these pieces together, different ways in the organization. They wanted to know how to adopt a framework with end-to-end process cycles, so procure to pay, order to cash, so on and so forth.
I love that. That's such a great question. So I'll repeat, how many frameworks do you have in your organization? You have one, okay? And it's like the Lego building blocks, right? What you're talking about, cross-functional processes, these are things that are built from the process framework, and they represent how you've created value in your organization. So it's representing how the customer sees you. Your customer doesn't necessarily see you as accounts payable, accounts receivable. They have to deal with all that stuff, but that's not how they deal with you when you buy a product. They go to sales and then this and then that and the other thing. It's tied together in that cross-functional process. So when you create the cross-functional process tied back to the process framework, and maybe even integrated with business unit models or systems architecture models, you can start to understand how things come together and where things fall apart. The problem that this creates for you, however, and I will be very transparent about this, is that you have to now create a management system for cross-functional processes because they don't belong inside your process framework. They belong in a process definition tool. The other thing about cross-functional processes is that typically there are roles identified of who performs what. Sales function does this, accounts function does this, and the processes go back and forth according to how they're distributed. Again, that doesn't belong in the framework. That's a downstream model that ties into the rest of your models in your organization. But all of those models come together through the use of the process framework.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. Next question is about how about operational risk and control? And I think you already touched on this associated with process and compliance.
Yes, I didn't touch a lot on it, but I will tell you that APQC has a tool called Mosaic, and Mosaic is complimentary to use for all members. There's no cost to do it. If you're a member, you get it. And Mosaic is a tool that's integrated with every process framework that we have out there. We at APQC have recently gone through our SOC audits. We are SOC certified, I think 1, 2, 3, 1977, 25, whatever, all kinds of different ones. But the way that we did it was to look at our processes, obviously, and try to understand where there might be gaps. Had we used our own tool, had we used our own dog food, it would have been a lot easier. At this point, what we had to do was walk around to every department and interview them individually. But Mosaic, as a central structure, can bring together all that compliance information. You can even create a process framework that you've adopted as one framework, and then in Mosaic, create a second framework that represents your compliance needs and link the two together so that you have a view for your compliance people that ties back into your processes or ties into your org charts or ties into whatever models you want. So processes at the core of what you do helps tie everything together. And Mosaic as a tool helps kind of simplify that use.
I got an add-on for that one, John. We also did a lot of research early last year looking specifically at the overlap between process frameworks, process management, and ISO compliance. So in the follow-up email, I'll make sure Maddie does this, send you guys some of the links to the content on that topic, including kind of an overlap matrix that some organizations were using between their ISO certification requirements and the components of the PCF, as long as well with their process owners.
Right on. Very good.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one more question, maybe, Maddie?
Yes.
Okay. So their organization has different viewpoints of itself. They've got functional or capabilities, so people, process, tech, info models, and a customer value chain model. Are there examples of how the PCF as a process model can support all of these other models?
You know, I don't have a document that summarizes all of that. This slide deck is probably the closest I have right now. And again, this slide deck is based on conversations I've had with organizations over the past 13 years and how they see these things integrating. I'm happy to meet with you offline and help you kind of develop and collaborate on something that could work for you in that. Just get in touch with us. You've got my contact information here. And I'm happy to work with you on that.
All right. I know we have several other questions. One of the things John and I will work together to make sure that all of your questions get answered. We'll also follow up and compile a FAQ of this session. So pointing out all the questions and the answers and make that available also within the next couple of weeks.
Great. Thank you guys for letting me share my passion with you. Again, my contact information is here. I welcome emails. I welcome phone calls. As we get, into correspondence, I'm happy to support you. My function here at APQC as the steward of the process framework means I get to talk to lots of people. So happy to talk to you too.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Holly. I'll just close this out here. As John mentioned, his contact details are here, and everyone will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording via email within a few days. So check your inbox for that. And I will add those resources that Holly mentioned that have to do with compliance to this slide, and you'll also get these resources in your follow-up email as well. And don't forget to connect with us on social. We post a lot of upcoming webinars, events, content and more. So be sure to check that out, and please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar satisfaction survey and let us know what you thought. Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope you attend next month's webinar.